climate change in the region, and then this idea about why bison or buffalo for a moving from perhaps cattle production to bison, and look at that from a production point of view as well as a conservation point of view, and then also a little bit on best management practices in the arena that I guess I'm most familiar with and most anxious to move forward with my research. So the Northern Great Plains often are separated along state boundaries anyway, with Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska. It turns out that really only the eastern half of Montana is really something that I would associate geographically with the Northern Great Plains, but nonetheless, it's generally the kind of area that we think about. And as you divide the country into these different regions, this is kind of how it's where we've seen sort of these general assessments come from, that usually come from statewide kinds of data. And so Montana is sort of weird because, or Montana and Wyoming really, because there's this whole western half that might be influenced those economic assessments to some degree. So in terms of looking at agriculture in the Northern Great Plains, which is the dominant part of the economy, we have a couple of different things. The percent of the national total livestock animals that are in the Northern Great Plains as of 2012 anyway, was about 21.9% of all the cows in the country are being produced in the Northern Great Plains. So and the other kinds of livestock are really sort of minimal representation relative to the other parts of the country. When we get to crop production, we can see that within the percent of totals, sorry, those numbers are so small, but we have about 70.6% in spring wheat, and durum wheat 72.2%. It doesn't, these weren't broken down by the additional winter wheat, which is surprising because I know that it's really on the increase in this region, particularly because of climate change, I would say, and it's the timing of that crop is pretty important to think about. But anyway, we're looking at, we're one of the major producers of or the breadbasket, perhaps we could call it, of the U.S. And then when we look at some of the other subsidiary crops, certainly sunflowers, we produce most of the sunflowers in the country. And dry edible beans are about 50%, as is barley, about 50% of what's produced in the country. So those are our crops. We do have, I will point to the use of corn, or the corn is grain and corn is silage, but corn is grain in particular, and that's usually matched with soybeans as well in the row below that. But that's at 20.2%, which is a pretty significant chunk when you think about the fact that some of those states like Iowa and Illinois and Ohio, et cetera, are big producers of corn. But that we still represent 20.2%. And I can tell you that that's definitely increasing, and particularly in Montana, we've seen a sharp increase over the last 3 or 4 years in production of corn and even soybeans, at least along our eastern border. The other major economic contributor, of course, is energy production. And I'm showing from this greenhouse gas emissions here is sort of a sidelight. I'll come back to this later, but the fact is that there's we're looking at one of the rapid development of oil and gas kinds of production, and of course with that we produce a lot of greenhouse gases. But that's northern parts of North Dakota and eastern part of northeastern part of Montana are most significant development of that area. So this is sort of by proxy. That's a map of where that activity is. Another really important cultural part, of course, of this region is the amount of land dedicated to, and just the cultural aspect of having a lot of reservations in this region, and I think that contributes largely to a number of factors that are important, and I'll talk about that too as I go along. So one of the things that some of the changes that are occurring that could be significant is that a lot of this region we're seeing is being plowed for crops, and a lot of that is corn production. So about 0.75% annual loss of the northern Great Plains prairie from 2009 to 2015. And from what I understand, that has not slowed down. We're looking at that to continue, and it's kind of moving from the east to the west. That those lands that are being broken out for the first time, sometime in many cases. So that's something going on. It's probably being pushed, as I said before, as much by climate change as economics. But anyway, it's pretty important. The northern Great Plains is interesting in this actually shows you that cultivated land in the orange, and you can kind of see how it's increased, and it's not just the US, it's up into Canada as well. When you look at all the cultivated land, there's some gaps in that cultivated land in this APR region. This was from an APR publication, but it was nice because it showed all these areas that are cultivated, and then those that are not. But it's interesting to see where those gaps are, but also just to get a sense for how much cultivated land there really is in this region. There's a bit on the economics here. This is from an APR, an American Prairie Reserve publication. It's clearly promoting the idea that it's a good idea to preserve land. I'm not here to promote that necessarily, but what I'm here to do is to just present it as I guess a hypothesis that they link some things and make some assumptions and come up with these. But it is interesting to look at what those possibilities might be. So when we go to Montana and just specifically start to look at what's land ownership look like, where the yellow areas in particular are U.S. Bureau of Land Management, and then we got U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and then we have the tribal areas in brown. You start to see that this region in Montana that you're in is really dominated by these federal lands and tribal lands, and so I think that's part of the thought process, certainly around developing the American Prairie Reserve idea, but it's also, it should be important from us to think about how do we use that land, and what's the most effective ways of managing that land. And so that's where my interests really lie. Right now, if we actually look at the land area in different kinds of production, a big chunk of it is in cattle production. And so that's been a sustainable activity in general for a number of years. And it's an effective way to use that land that's always been marginal. Some of it was cultivated, but often abandoned because people couldn't support real cropland types of agriculture on that land. So that's been a dominant feature of how a lot of this landscape has been managed. I'm going to turn now to climate assessment a little bit, and wanted to talk about a lot of the information that I'll draw from is from the Montana Climate Assessment. I was a lead author on the agricultural part of the climate assessment, but there's a lot of useful information in this 2017 assessment, and I think you'll find that it has some observations that are useful for starting to think about the future of management. So if we just look at the history of climate in Montana, if we look from 1895 to 2015, we can see that the temperatures, the annual average temperature has had an increasing trend. Even though it goes up and down from time to time, it has had an increasing trend. And that trend has become even more significant in the last 80 years or so, when we really started increasing our industrial production and release of CO2 into the atmosphere. So our current average temperature is about 45 degrees Fahrenheit for Montana as a whole. On average, temperature has increased by about 0.42 degrees Fahrenheit per decade over the last 65 years. This is an overall increase of 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. That might not seem like much, but in comparison to the US annual average, the increase rate is 0.26 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're about double what the national average is since 1950. And that's pretty impressive. It's partially because those states that are coastal, they tend to be buffered by the oceans and don't see the increase that we do, even under the same sorts of constraints when we're contained inside the continent. So that's a lot of the reason why we have a higher increase, but it should be somewhat of an alarm as well in terms of what we're looking at if that increase continues. And all of the models that we have used to project increases are looking out at the mid-century increases to be about 5 to 7 degree increases in the winter, and 6 to 7.5 degree increases in the summer. So there's a lot of agreement. We use 21 different global climate models to make this assessment, scaled those down, went through all kinds of rigmarole to ensure that we were making a good assessment of those. And here the legend is showing these colors, which all the columns are the months of the year. The regions within Montana are the rows. So you can see that for north central Montana and northeast Montana, the portions that you might be most interested in or locally interested in, we can see what the change in temperature has been. And so August is clearly up in this 7 to 8 degree kind of temperature increase on average over the whole year. And those summer months are definitely the time when we're getting the most heat. So, but really it's throughout the year as well. When you look at all those colors are up here in the 5 to 7 or 8 degree region. So we're warming up. Often I find that people don't register on that all that well, but think about more their local weather station. But that's weather. But I'm going to show you some of that weather data anyway. When we talk about climate, we're usually talking about larger spatial scales and certainly longer time scales. But if we just look from 1990 to 2019, so basically the last 30 years, we can find the stations in the state where we've had a significant increasing trend or a decreasing trend for that matter. And what we see that in these June, July, August, the summer months, there's a number of stations that are showing increasing trend and none showing decreasing trend. Some that aren't showing any trend for that period. These dots that don't have a square around them. The squares indicate that there's an increasing trend. So you can see that certainly up in this area, there is some increasing trends. and those were maximum temperatures for the day. If we look at the minimum temperatures, which would be basically nighttime temperatures for the summer, we see other places where there is increasing trends in eastern Montana, and those are important because those are often the temperatures that we associate with the greatest human health impacts, uh, and definitely impacts cows, because if we have these really high temperatures during the day but don't cool off at night, it has a big impact on human health and cattle performance. So I'll come back to that here later. So in terms of winter temperatures, if we look at the mean minimum daily winter temperatures, these are a smattering of stations. I didn't look at all the stations, but these are the stations where those were increasing. So we can see that those minimum temperatures were increasing in the winter. So again, it's just further real specific place-based assessment of the fact that much of Montana has places where we're increasing our temperatures. Okay, precipitation that came out of this assessment, and again, there's using the global climate models, we can project out to this 2040 to 2060, this mid-century period. And what we're basically indicating across the state is that we're getting wetter springs, it looks like, and we're getting much drier in the summer. This has some very important consequences. These models aren't quite as good. The model agreement is only about 85% among the 21 models that we looked at this. But nonetheless, with that level of agreement, it's still something we probably should be adjusting to. And we look at the change in the number of inches of precipitation and 0.4, 0.2, you can see those are the increases, and the minus 0.2, minus 0.4 inch kind of range are what we're looking at in terms of those changes. So hotter and drier is the, I guess, underlying message. If we take those climate measurements and actually add in drought and the potential for drought, we can actually develop this ecosystem climate sensitivities in the US, which was done by a group at the University of Montana. And it's pretty revealing, and they did it for the entire West, but you can see that, boy, Eastern Montana is really looking at a sensitivity, a negative sensitivity increase, a negative sensitivity. That means it's getting worse. Increased sensitivity, really, even though those numbers are negative. So that's another important point in terms of trying to put together a number of different measures to really assess what are the impacts likely to be. I'm going to add in one piece here. This is from a most recent report that we just released here in Montana on the climate change and human health. And again, I was a co-author on this, but in this case, what we did is really try to look at what are the human impacts going to be from heat in particular. So this is a human vulnerability to heat measure, which comes from combining adaptive capacity, sensitivity, and exposure, and using data from a lot of county data that is sort of social in nature or economic in nature. And we're able to come up with classifying counties according to their sensitivities. And you can see that our Eastern Montana counties are really apt to have in the future a greater sensitivity when it comes to human health. So what does this all mean? And I'm going to use agriculture here as sort of an example of when we make decisions and try to determine what are the effects of climate really going to be on a state like ours. And agriculture is a good one because we really depend, especially in the eastern part of the state, on agriculture, whether it be cropland agriculture or livestock production. But it's really complex to try to estimate what will those impacts be, because any decisions that are made and where we might think that maybe we should change the way we make decisions or change the kinds of decisions that we make in agriculture, we start to look at all the factors that are influencing them. And along this edge here, we see that government policies certainly play a role. Expected prices received for crops, that plays a role. Production inputs, pests, all these things come into play for most of our larger decisions that we make that are really going to determine your sustainability in your system. And we look at the things that actually affect those, these factors that are in the boxes, like global price, insurance, local price, contracts, all these kinds of things that can play an important role. And then we look at climate. Well, it affects all of those, and it affects them at different scales. And it might be even how the climate is affecting a scale away from us. But the fact is, it makes it really difficult. And what that means, I think most importantly, and we saw this actually in the human health indicators, is there's a great deal of uncertainty that's crept into making management decisions on the landscape. And that uncertainty can have impacts on human health, certainly mental health, but it also has a big impact on just what do we do? What's the best thing that we can do to add resilience to these kinds of changes? So that's sort of the climate situation. Now I want to talk about buffalo, bison. How do we, so why bison? Why should we look at bison production? Well, I can say based from a climate perspective, and I'm not a rangeland specialist. I'm not an animal physiologist, but all I can do is in reading the literature, I can look at it and I can say, you know, there's some really interesting patterns in this. And one of them is that as the first sense was, you know, we really need to prepare livestock production for these changing climates. And really one of the major ways that we should be looking at this is perhaps changing the genetics or developing the genetics in our cattle production and in our other livestock so that they can withstand heat. And the more I kind of looked into that and saw that really the trends that we see are kind of going in the wrong direction. And in fact, when I say wrong direction, we're all about producing black cows and increasing the number of black cows, and they tend to be particularly vulnerable to heat. And so this is an issue. But the more I looked into the livestock situation, the more I started to realize that, and started to look over at bison, I started to realize that, wow, rather than change the genetics of cattle, maybe we ought to be thinking a lot more about changing the animal, and perhaps bison would be better. And sure enough, we see that bison tend to withstand dry conditions much better, and I'll go into the specifics of that here in a minute. They definitely deal with snow and extreme events, snow situations, much better than cattle. In terms of just production management, they're easier in many respects because when it comes to calving, they do it on their own. Certainly when it comes to water, which is going to be one of our major issues coming into the future in mid-century, as we warm and we're drying out, providing water for animals is going to be really important. And it turns out that bison don't need as much water, and they're much better at finding water than cows, which you have to basically supply water fairly close to where they are. So those are just a couple, and I'll go on to talk a little bit more about that. But the other thing I want to point out is that a lot of the climate change discussion has moved toward this idea that, well, we've got to get away from producing meat, and we've got to get away from a meat diet or meat-based diet. And I would argue that, well, there's no indication of that, because if we look at meat production, it's historical versus, and it's projected. and even with the human population kind of starting to level out, perhaps by mid-century, the meat production isn't. And in fact, in a global sense, we're looking at people continuing to eat more meat. So we're still talking about producing meat, and it's meat production is going to fall in places like Montana, where if our climate is going to be creating conditions that are just not conducive to crop production, there's going to be more animal and livestock production, and that's going to result in some real pressures for how exactly we can do that in an efficient way, given these projected conditions. This is just a quick assessment of sort of the global situation. Again, going back to 1971 and up through 2011, every 10 years, looking at how we've seen a change. And in these different countries, it's amazing to look at some of these countries and the amount of meat that we're looking at them consuming. And even places like India are consuming so much more meat than we would have really anticipated probably 20 years ago. And so these are amazing increases in the kilograms per capita consumption of meat, so per person consumption. And so again, it just tells me that meat production is going to happen, and it's going to be places like Montana that are going to play a big role in that. So if we look at, let's go back to bison now. The number of bison in private commercial herds is that solid black line, and the number of bison in public and conservation herds, of course, where most of the bison have been historically, have been at this sort of flat level. But we have seen a real increase in the number of bison that are in captivity and producing, really following pretty much a cattle sort of model. Again, we'll talk about that here a little more in a second, but some important aspects, and this is kind of getting back to that point I was making about the fact that if we look at cattle distribution or probability of use along this distance from water measure, we find out that cattle really concentrate around the water and won't leave that water, especially as it gets hotter and drier. On the other hand, bison are much more evenly distributed and will move to and from water in a much greater way. So this is all information supported in the literature. This is a similar paper that was looking at bison versus cattle and their use around water. And again, here you go. This is the 20 to 40 meter distance from water. And if you look at the hatched bars, which are bison, versus the white bars here, you're seeing that cattle are far outdoing bison in terms of use around the water. And then it starts to, the amount of activity in these areas declines for bison, versus cattle are out here using these areas, but there are far more of them are using the areas closer to water. So cattle preferred all riparian areas more than bison. Bison demonstrated a small avoidance to all riparian areas. So there's something to the fact that bison might be our preferred animal. This is comparing in a very similar landscape cattle use, and these dots are actually ear tag measures of where bison are versus where cattle were on a snapshot in time. But in these bison pastures, you'll notice that the dots are far more spread out, and you can see that along the streams, the cattle really concentrate and around the water sources, versus not the case here in the with the bison that spread themselves out much more. So I think it just further accentuates the fact that those concentrations can really look at differences. It also, of course, says how they're utilizing the landscape and how they're much more consistently using all portions of the landscape being used by the bison, versus cows really concentrating in those areas that are going to maintain greener grass. and that's around those riparian areas. Another study showed here is that forage patch size for bison, just a real distinct look versus cattle. Very different kinds of use and much larger use areas by bison. Again, they spread themselves out. Again, contributing to the fact that they're probably a better animal for what our future climate is looking at. Just another case for that. In this case, along the x-axis here is NDVI, a greenness measure that we get from satellites, and the probability of animal use. Cattle simply migrate to the greener conditions, and we'll utilize those greener conditions. Bison up to a certain point, but then it actually falls off. They aren't attracted as much to the greener conditions necessarily. So that was an interesting finding. So kind of in summary, if we look at for each of the regions in Montana, if we look at the increase in the number of days that are projected to be over 90 degrees, we're looking at up to 35 days in some of these eastern Montana regions. Up to 35 days of temperatures being higher than 90 degrees, the maximum temperatures being greater than 90. That's a significant increase, and that really will have an impact on how well these animals do. So Montana livestock can only withstand major heat during the day if those days are followed by cool nights. On hot days, livestock require more water nearby, which increases producer costs and impacts on waterways. And it calls for a need for breeding programs specifically focused on heat tolerance and grass cover crop finishing. So I think that part of this, and I'll get into this finishing aspect because I think that's a very important piece in the whole livestock puzzle that we're trying to put together here. But again, the focus, if we changed our focus to a different animal, in this case bison, we might find that we have a better potential to move forward with our agricultural production and looking at producing red meat with these animals rather than the ones we have historically. An important part of this is just how we raise these animals. So we have 9 million head of cattle in beef and feedlots across the high plains. 85% of those U.S. beef feedlot inventory ends up in these feedlots. Other is about 15% in these other states. But this real concentration of feedlots is an issue, and it's an issue from a number of points. Number one, in Montana, we're transporting almost all of our cows, our 3 million cows that we produce, and a portion of those, of course, each year are going off to feedlots to be fed, and utilizing crops that are energy intensive and greenhouse gas emission producing crops, not to mention the greenhouse gases that might be coming off of these systems. So if we just look at methane emissions, for example, in the country, these red areas and lighter color areas are where we have high emissions. We have some in Montana, but where it's really high is in these areas where you have both feedlots and you have a lot of corn and soybean production. But those methane production is important because methane is about 26 times greater insulating product going into the atmosphere than is CO2. So it's especially important to pay attention to that. If we overlay on those states, those areas where we have all the feedlots, we start to see that there not only are we coinciding in those areas, but that's an important emission that we should pay attention to. So when it comes to climate mitigation, these are things that are going to be driving us toward not finishing our animals in feedlots. And so if we're feeding cattle in feedlots, maybe we ought to be looking at a different animal that we could feed and finish in a different place. Just to further go into that, if we look at the relative contributions of CO2 versus methane going into the atmosphere here, and we look at this in terms of kilotons, we're getting, urea fertilizer is certainly important. But if we look down here at methane, the methane coming off of our animals, and particularly the enteric fermentation and manure management kinds of things, it's even greater. And so this is further evidence that we really need to be thinking about how we might change our production system. So, so the question starts to come to be down to, well, if we're going to produce our red meat with a new animal, i.e. bison, how should we do it? Well, if we basically follow the cattle model and just put them in pens, I'm not sure that we're producing any, if we're gaining much. So if we just end up shipping our bison off to Nebraska, Iowa, Colorado, etc., then to finish them in a pen on corn and soybeans, we're probably not really accomplishing much. However, if we leave those animals in the field and finish them in a more natural condition, then we're probably gaining in a number of ways. And we certainly know that the cattle production, the meat from cattle produced on the range or on grass versus in captivity and being finished on grains, are not producing the healthy meat. But bison, we don't know for sure. But nonetheless, it seems like it's an animal that very likely would follow that same sort of pattern that we see of grass-fed versus feedlot-fed animals. Okay, I'm going to shift gears again now and talk about conservation. And conservation, well, I'm going to relate back to bison here in a minute, but I wanted to start by saying that if we look at the amount of area of different biomes in the world, this is a global assessment. We look at the number of the proportion of lands that are preserved. We're seeing that this percentage is really lowest in the temperate grasslands, the very areas that we're talking about that Eastern Montana is part of. So conservation in these areas, certainly the targets, the international targets for conservation are to try to increase up to 30 to 50%. And you can see that none of these biomes are we getting to that, but we're not even up to 2% or even 1% perhaps in our region or in the grasslands. So that's an area that looking for areas to do more conservation in grasslands will be important for just general global biodiversity. As part of that, we can kind of look at this number of species and how that has changed, or how we have the historic versus current versus the change in biodiversity. And these darker colors are where we've lost more species, the lighter colors, not so much loss. And then they're broken down by all species versus carnivores versus ungulates. And you can see that more species have been extirpated from at least part of the grasslands than any of the North America, of any of the North American biome. 74% of 39 obligate species are imperiled or are endangered or in danger of going extinct. Of carnivores and ungulate grasslands, lost more on average and greater maximum species loss than any other biome. So global wildlife declines by 1/2 since about 1970. So these are issues, and there's certainly a societal call for finding ways to do more conservation. And so as we think about conservation and the things that go into ecosystem conservation, this is kind of an interesting way of looking at it, especially putting it in the context of grazing animals. So, and those that we might manage, or even wildlife. But since most of the animals out on the grassland landscapes anyway are, are livestock, we can kind of think of this as livestock or animal complexity. If we add more animals to the system, more different kinds of grazers, we're going to move along this x-axis. And the complexity of the environment moves up this y-axis. We start to see conservation value move from low to much higher as we sort of mix up our use of these grasslands. And there's this, of course, the kinds of things that are the landscape diversity things and the disturbance. This shows fire, the scale at which these things happen are all important scales that are sort of being compressed into one here. And along this complexity side is not just species, but age and sex and the diversity of perhaps even the genetics in those systems can be important. So that's an interesting diagram that sort of represents this idea that really is worthy of testing, especially as we start to think about how can we pull conservation into or make it part of a management process that isn't just about production, isn't just about conservation, but where we really try to merge the two ideas. In terms of some work that's been done, Kurt Friese and others, Fuhlendorf and Kyron, my co-author here, have thought a lot about how might bison play a role in this process of as we restore bison on these kinds of prairies. What do we get out of it in the way of restoration? I'm not going to go through all the specifics there, but I think what you start to see is that there are a lot of aspects of bringing bison onto the landscape that really start to benefit a lot of the conditions that will be conducive to conservation. So that perhaps production and conservation really can come together where with a focus on bison. I'm going to add to that another aspect to me that's really important, and I would hope would be important to Native people, is that I think that bison or buffalo have a real cultural significance in the landscape, and the fact that bison co-evolved with both people and all the other species on our rangelands, that perhaps that's it's only fitting that they might be the elemental keystone species perhaps that can encourage these kinds of changes. This is just further looking at stalking rates or grazing intensity and how it sort of encourages different kinds of species in different kinds of conditions in the ecosystem. Again, I don't need to go through the specifics there. You can kind of look through those, but I think it's really important to think about how we go from this traditional range management to more of a conservation or a conservation ethic perhaps on these landscapes, and how we might be able to combine them in some way. So as we look at that, here this is just an example of how different a set of different bird species tend to coincide with different use intensities. What's amazing about bison is that they kind of create all of these intensities themselves on the same landscape by just the fact that they move far more than cattle do. And therefore, they tend to be kind of in this middle region, and therefore capturing many more species than perhaps what you might expect from a cattle production kind of operation. So getting back to the American Prairie Foundation and their the reserve that they're promoting, that's kind of one end of the spectrum that I see. And again, I'm not here to promote that concept, But I think it's an interesting one in that it's still part of this idea that in a larger landscape, we have to start to think about, because it seems to be coming, that conservation can be done, perhaps, but how do we do it in light of the conditions that if we do preserve large portions of the landscape into more of a wild case where we'd have wild bison and all the other creatures that go along with it, like these predators, how are we going to manage our operations in some new or different way? And so I think management is key. And this is an area, as I said, that I hope my future research is really trying to move toward. And it's not just me, but others. The Smithsonian Institute is certainly interested in working in this area. And Gila Shimon is a good example. Claire Bresnan is doing some of this kind of work where I think we start to combine the knowledge that we have, probably, well, maybe most importantly, really the indigenous knowledge about how these animals behave and how we might manage them, but combining that, or certainly in parallel, working with all the modern technologies that allow us to determine these dots, for example, or where the animals are from GPS ear tags, and also starting to look at how do they use the landscape, where these colors that we might look at in terms of resource use, selection models that we can build are often based on satellite kinds of information, or maybe information from drones. So we have a lot more information at our fingertips to perhaps develop management that can move toward production, and at the same time be thinking about these use of larger landscapes, use of strategic use of water sources, which are these black dots in this system, and also looking at how we can be thinking about conservation at the same time. Part of that, of course, is just how do we use fencing? How do we actually capture or keep animals in a place versus not? And can those coincide with some of the other kinds of conservation interests? And this, many of you have probably seen these kinds of things where we configure fences perhaps differently, be thinking about how we do those, using cameras to monitor what goes on those landscapes and in those places where we have migration routes, and developing ways and learning how to manage around this dual objective of conservation and production. So as I said before, I think a very important part of this is indigenous knowledge and thinking about how we draw on that indigenous knowledge to move ourselves forward in a management system on these grasslands that coincides with what native folks know and elders have passed along. And I think that's how we do that, how we pull that in, is really crucial. A project that's just under initiation at Montana State University, headed up right now by Jill Mackin and others, Buffalo Nation's Food System Initiative, is really trying to identify all these different kinds of projects that might come together and really accomplish some of this knowledge and bringing back the bison and using it in a way, or drawing on that knowledge that is so crucial to moving us forward and getting to some sort of endpoint that I think will pay off in the end and really deal with what our future conditions are likely to be. So I'll stop there and let you ask questions as you have interest to. I'm not sure how you want to handle this, but I'm happy to answer them in whatever way. If you're going to write in the chat, then I'm not sure I have access to that right now. So anyway, I'll stop there. So Dan, will you manage that if questions come in the chat?
Yeah, we have somebody doing that, and we would offer people to ask questions to Bruce just verbally. If you'd like to ask a question, you can either raise your hand or just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, I have one from Dennis in Long Knife in chat. I'm going to go ahead. I don't know if you can see that, Bruce, but I'll read it.
I can't.
You can't see it?
Oh, wait, maybe I can. Yes, I can. I'm sorry. Let me look here. Dennis Long. Call. Glad to see this call. Longspur name has changed. Oh, the grassland bird. Yeah. Okay. Who had a? Okay, so the McCown's longspur name has changed. The grassland bird was named after McCown, who had a bad relationship with area tribes. So that was one of the driving factors for the name change. It is now called the thick-billed longspur. Good to know. Thank you.
There's one from Molly.
Oh,
Dodge.
has there been a market feasibility study to see if people are willing to switch from beef to bison consumption? There has been some of those kinds of things. It's not on the tip of my tongue as to what those outcomes were in any quantitative way, but that would be something that would have been good to include in this talk. I should have looked into that. So I don't know the answer to that. For sure, I'm pretty sure they have been done. I think that there's a lot of assumptions though that I found in those talking to producers that have basically been following a model of cattle production with bison. There is the general assumption that market will not increase, that market is unlikely to move towards a grass-fed kind of production system because of just general people's taste for having fat-infused meat. I think that's probably changing in my opinion, but who knows?
Okay, Claire Bresnan has raised her hand. Claire, if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Maxwell, for that wonderful presentation. It's a great overview of the state of bison and potential for introduction. My question is kind of similar to the last one, but I was wondering what the largest barriers to switching to bison production are, and I guess it seems like that not finishing your bison or cattle in a feedlot would maybe lead to less meat production per unit of land, and if the economic incentives or the ecological incentives could make up for that and sway ranchers to change the production animal.
Well, I think, certainly consumer preference is going to play a role in that, but I think we're seeing that changing certainly with beef production, for example. So I can't believe that it wouldn't also be the same for bison. But having said that, there's probably going to have to be a phase in, phase out kind of thing that goes on. So I suspect, and I've actually seen ranches that are finishing animals on their ranch, but they put them in a pen, but it's a much larger pen, often 40 to 50 acre size kind of pen with fairly low densities of the animals. And they're feeding them with barley cakes, something barley we produce. And so using some sort of unique approaches that still apparently are producing a product that is acceptable and is going onto the market and being sold. So I think the options are there and the possibilities are there, but we might have to move it in a gradual way, I guess, back to where yeah, to back to where I think we can bring the consumer along with this idea that really these animals and the benefits that we might get from the animals, especially with regard to conservation, with regard to climate mitigation, et cetera, are so great that the value is there in having an animal that actually just finishes on the landscape. So that's I think that's the most important sort of step in this process. But I'm not sure that we can't find also ways of selecting for behaviors in our animals that allow certain animals that produce a kind of quality meat, and having a marketing campaign that really goes after this idea, I think would be have a huge impact. And we just haven't seen that kind of money being put behind those approaches. Certainly, government programs can play a big role. I mean, we know that the government programs do play a huge role in agriculture in general. But if suddenly we had agricultural programs that started to support this kinds of production, or production that was dual in sort of nature in terms of conservation as well as production, that could make a huge difference in itself. So I think there are options. I think there are opportunities. Thanks for the question, Claire.
Yeah, thank you.
Bruce, there's several questions on chat again, and I'll ask you the first one from Molly Dodge.
Mm-hmm.
And her question is, infrastructure is the infrastructure process to process bison the same as cattle, and what new facilities may be required?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not an expert in that arena, but I know that, I mean, just handling bison is different than cows. Certainly, they are the operations that I have seen. They have some quite large infrastructure changes that they have to go through when they're moving from cattle to bison, and having much more substantial kinds of chutes and things like that. But the animals have to be are only typically handled less, and so you have some sort of exchange perhaps there. But in terms of processing, I mean, we really need to change processing regardless of whether we move from bison or cattle. We need to localize more processing no matter what, because we're going to have to get away from this idea of moving cows so far to feedlots and slaughter, and feedlots that are dependent upon crops that we're just not going to be able to afford to produce from a global food production point of view, if nothing else. So there's changes that have to occur. Exactly what those changes are, I'm not entirely sure. What all of that would constitute.
Hi, this is Hila. Bruce, can I just add on to
Sure.
what you just said for Molly? One of the main things that are different between bison and cattle in terms of the pastures is that you don't need as much fencing for bison as you do for cattle, and it's significantly less. So you would only have the exterior fencing and a very large pasture. In terms of wildlife movements, that's a huge thing in terms of landscape permeability and fragmentation across that landscape.
Thanks, Hila. I see another question from Shantae Sinclair. Yeah. And the question is, are you familiar with Alan Savory and his research on flash grazing as an approach to cattle management and ecological restoration? I am somewhat familiar with that. And the first thing I'll say is basically so much of that approach is trying to duplicate what bison would do naturally. So much of it is really based on other animals, large ungulates moving through grasslands, his initial ideas, of course, coming from Africa primarily. But yeah, the idea is that grasslands where grasses and shrubs and forbs that evolved with these animals that are grazers and are in herds usually went through that process or followed that sort of behavior, which was intense grazing in a few areas and then moving away, but probably not returning for a few years to that same place where there was this intense grazing. So it makes a lot of sense. Can you duplicate with cattle what you would gain from bison? Probably to a certain extent, but what you might not be able to do is duplicate the ability to withstand extreme conditions, and especially those heat conditions that we're looking at in the future. I hope I answered your question. Here's another question.
Yeah, there is a question about that, Bruce, about what makes, what about buffalo that helps them do better in the heat? You see that question from Rod?
You know, I
Benson?
don't, and I don't know the exact physiology of that, but there's been a number of studies done. And so, gosh, I wish I could point to those. I didn't bring that into this talk. I should have, that would have been a good thing to do. I have read those papers and I'm not remembering the authors. There's some work being done on animal physiology, bison physiology specifically at South Dakota State University. And so I think I'd go there first to kind of look that up. But yeah, it is interesting that one of the paper that perhaps has gotten the most attention is one that shows as you heat up an area that bison size drops. And in fact, we can look at the history of bison size and its predecessor in the paleobiology, and we can see that the bison size has dropped over a general warming of the climate. But that's some work that's been going on as well. So there is, yeah, without a specific citation there, I sorry that I can't give you the specifics of what it is different about their physiology. Here's another.
There's a comment from Dennis Longknife about when buffalo wallow.
Oh yeah, sure. I think there's something, yeah, to that. I don't know how that is specifically different than cattle necessarily, but certainly they dust themselves, and with lighter earth, they're basically making their hide more reflective and therefore can handle more heat that way. That makes sense, and I have actually seen that. I should have remembered to mention that, but thanks for that jogging my memory on that one. Any other questions?
Okay, yeah, do we have any more questions? And if not, I think I'm gonna let you go, Bruce, and I'd really like to thank you for your talk. It's, really a important topic in our area as up here in Fort Belknap, where we are at. We do have a tribal bison herd, and it's pretty significant size herd. Gila is actually working with our bison program here with the Bronx Peak Thunder, and she's doing one of those tracking projects using those GPS tags. I don't know, Gila, are you still on here?
Yes, I'm here.
And
Yeah,
I don't know, maybe you want to make a short comment about that, but anyway, Bruce kind of brought up those type of projects with I think maybe, I'm not sure if that was your project he was talking about earlier with the APR, or not sure.
That was a previous study that looked at single individuals tracking bison with GPS collars. The difference is now
collars.
of what we're doing is that we're trying to tag significant proportions of each herd to look at how the herd is moving together. So all the individuals moving across the landscape and how they interact with one another. Because as you all know, bison are a herd species and they have bonds with one another. So we need to know how these groups are moving together so we understand how they're transforming the grasses or impacting other species. And that's the idea behind this study.
Yeah, that's really an exciting study, and I think that it's going to reveal a number of things that will be really pertinent to management. And like I said, I mean, when I say management, I think management that starts to look at the dual objective of producing meat and at the same time conserving other species. So thanks, Gila.
Okay.
That's good stuff.
Yeah. We're gonna let Dennis Longknife ask one question, and then I think we'll let Bruce go. Okay.
Good.
Yeah, hello, Bruce.
Hey, Dennis.
I remember meeting you a couple years ago at the Montana Climate Office. They had a conference in Missoula, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
I think I gave a little presentation there too, but
Yes.
when our program first started. But I made an interesting observation in our buffalo pasture last summer. I was documenting the breeding of the long-billed curlew in the south pasture out Snake Butte. And I seen this small pack of buffalo all stomping the ground in one little area. And it was in a place right past where I noticed you could really smell the strong fragrance of wild onion in the area. So after they left the area and they made their way down the coulee, I went over to where they were, and it looks like they were uprooting some of these wild onion plants and eating them. So they must smell them too. And then I was wondering, they probably enjoy eating them. Probably wouldn't be, the milk from them probably wouldn't be good for the calves, but I don't see it.
That's really interesting. That's you know, I've had more folks making observations like that. Almost always native peoples that have this keen ability to see things that others don't. There was a Blackfeet student that was telling me that they were observing bison in their herd up near Browning, and they were noticing that that there was a beetle that they hadn't observed or wasn't on any lists on the dung of the bison, and wasn't on any cattle dung. And so they looked into it and found out that this was a beetle that no one had observed in a long time, but it had started to really come back with the bison, and apparently was helping, was known to be a species that was really important in the manure breakdown. But the same thing was not occurring. So that's, they attributed that to getting much more rapid breakdown of the dung in those systems. So another one of those unique sort of observations that I think are really interesting things to follow up on and to watch, and through lots of observations and ways of developing, you know, some sort of organization to these observations, I think it will contribute so much to understanding what these animals do and how they're performing in the system, or how they're performing a benefit perhaps to the system. Thanks, that's great.
Somebody asked a question about what beetle species was found on the bison dung, but
Yeah,
I don't know if you know that or not.
I don't remember. I'm sorry. And they found out. They actually looked into it.
Yeah.
I'll see if I can recover that one, because it's such a great story. I should a lot of these things that I should include in a talk like this.
Okay, Bruce, I really appreciate your talk, and so seems like we had some pretty interesting questions. And anyway, just
it was really
like
fun. Thanks.
Yeah, and I like to apologize for the brief technical difficulties I had at the beginning. I got kind of confused with Facebook. I was trying to get Facebook Live going, and I had it on my own Facebook page, and I didn't have it on the Ani Nakota Facebook page. So we had some people wondering about that. And anyway,
Okay.
I'm not a technology expert with all of this new, social media and stuff. So I kind of.
So
have
I do see that you are recording this. You
Yeah,
might,
yeah.
If you could send me the link to that, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll have to figure that out. But I'll do
Okay.
that.
All right, good. Thanks. No problem if you don't.
Yeah. And
All right,
thanks
good.
everybody for logging in and participating, and we'll see you next time.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. See ya.